Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Friends' last event for 2022. To begin, we are meeting this evening on the beautiful country of Ngunnawal and Ngambri, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and through them to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. My name is Sue Gage, and I'm a member of the Friends Committee. Tonight, we will meet Pamela Burton and Meredith Edwards. They are sisters and have jointly written their book, Persons of Interest, an intimate account of Cecily and John Burton about their extraordinary parents. Pamela, Meredith and I are all old Canberrans, and we've been friends for many years. We will also meet Allen Mawer, who will be interviewing Pamela and Meredith. Pamela left her legal practice to write full-time. The books she has written are From Moree to Mabo, The Mary Gaudron Story, The Waterloo Killings, A Portrait of a Family Tragedy, and A Foreign Affair. In 1976, Pamela founded her own law firm, Pamela Coward and Associates, and later practiced as a barrister at the Canberra Bar. She also served on various federal and territory boards and tribunals. Pamela is currently a part-time ACT Magistrates Court-appointed independent mediator. Meredith Edwards AM is Emeritus Professor at the University of Canberra. She was Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Canberra and Director of its National Institute for Governance from 1997 to 2004. She was also a Senior Policy Advisor in the Australian Public Service. Meredith was involved in a range of major social policy reforms across several departments from 1983 to 1993. And was Deputy Secretary in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet until 1997. She was also a member of the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Administration between 2010 and 2017. Meredith authored Social Policy, Public Policy from Problem to Practice and co-authored Public Sector Governance in Australia. Pamela and Meredith will be interviewed by Allen Mawer, who is a local author and president of the Canberra and District Historical Society. Allen is an eclectic historian who has written well-received books on Canberra, Australian folklore, whaling and exploration. Allen's best-known works in these genres are Canberry Tales, Wild Colonial Boys, Ahab's Trade and Incognita. His most recent work is a book about Magellan's navigation, and it is currently in the press. Allen was previously a Senior Executive Service Officer in the Australian Public Service.
Thank you, Sue. And good evening, friends. Now, it seems to me that the slide you see behind you is a little ambiguous, but the book is, as advertised in the subtitle, an intimate account of Cecily and John Burton. And as a result, of course, it's the story of a marriage. But let me go back to the origins of it, as elucidated in the book. This book is John Howard's fault. In 2006, addressing a dinner to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the conservative journal Quadrant, he went back, at that stage he must have been going back 50 years, and he described John Burton as a philo-communist. I don't think at the time he even knew John was still alive, but he certainly found out very quickly because John actually responded in a spirited article in the Canberra Times. But the controversy didn't go away and was in fact inflamed after his death in 2010 when Des Ball decided to write a very provocative article in The Australian about moles in the Canberra Public Service during John's time there as a departmental head. And it got a little more interesting in 2013 when Pam went to a party and Des Ball was there. And Jack Waterford, provocateur remarkable, thought that Pamela should talk to him. And they did. And they had a first-class barney in the kitchen. Thereafter, Pamela said, we needed to get the record straight on my father. So she wrote a piece, and then decided that no, a piece in its own right wasn't enough. Her father deserved a biography, and she could write it. But I have to tell you, my dear, that's not what this book is. It's not a biography of your father, so what happened?
Well, I didn't intend to write a biography of my father. I wanted to tell his story. I was, you're right, motivated by anger of these allegations that came up, which are detailed in the book, to defend my father. And as I said, I did a bit of that through articles and so on. But that's not the whole story. My father, I knew, had a bigger story, bigger than just his 3-4 years in the public service. And I wanted to, if it was the last thing I did before I died, I wanted to put the record straight with his story, who he was, let people judge for himself. And how I knew my father was as a farmer. He wasn't in the public service in my cognizant age. He was an innovative farmer. He was an entrepreneur. He ran the quite different sort of bookshop, the Green Square Book and Record Shop in Kingston. He imported those bubble cars and Messerschmitts and assembled them in the back of the shop and sold them in the store. And then he got an old Canberra bus and fitted it out and decided that treacherous road journeys to the Snowy Mountains should be made with this bus full of records and books and magazines, all in European languages, to bring joy to the immigrant workers up in the various camps. They'd come home, they'd come back to the camps after days of work, and it's cold and freezing and they're bored and they're away from their families. And so this bus became really significant for them, and a lot of, it was important. So this is a different sort of picture that I had of my father to one where Des Ball suggests, and other people run with it, that he was a MKVD or something, spy recruited in Russia in 1934 when he was still at university. This is quite a different picture, and Meredith will talk later about this, but my life was very fulfilling, because after the bus and all that, while the bus and all the Messerschmitts and all these things were happening in my life, he also got an artist, a songwriter and musician, Australia's first most successful international, musical on stage, The Sentimental Bloke. He worked so hard to get that at Canberra Repertory Theatre, to get it on stage. He did it just because he wanted to see it occur, and that was like the best fun for us, because of course we met all the actors, and then following on that, he was still trying to struggle to earn a living after not being in the public service. Following on that, he was still writing about foreign policy and so on. That's the story I wanted to tell. I asked Meredith, would she help me, please?
And what did she say?
And when Meredith said, of course, but she had a very different view of this story.
Meredith?
So I said, only if our mother can be included in the story. And my aim was to get a story told of our parents for our family to know them, and that was what I wanted Pam to do. I didn't realise that in Pam's mind, for a while, I was a bit slow. In her mind, she was always thinking of a publication, wider audience. I was just thinking about something for the family. So we were a bit at cross purposes for a while. And when she said, "But I want to make a book of this," I said, "I think that's a bit ambitious, Pam, me of little faith." Anyway, she managed to pull that off, as you can see. So I was asking that Mum be included, and Pam eventually, she'll tell you how, worked out why Mum should be there. But I wanted to make sure that our mother, who was doing what they did in those days, their role was to support the husband and look after the kids and be homemakers. But she was much more than that, and she ended up getting out of the shadow of our father and having her own career. She was at the vanguard of being a separated woman, forging her own career in the 50s. And she then became a Jungian psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and she helped so many people. As our interviews with some of them indicated, she made a life difference to some people. And she had a dreamboat group as well, and she used to analyse dreams with this group. So she had an interesting story of her own, which I desperately wanted our family to hear about. And then Pam, being the compliant sister that she is, worked out a way of including our mother in the story.
Well, I always was I visualised the story that always included Cecily because of the way she met our father at university, fell in love with him and knew at the outset that he'd be bad for her and she shouldn't marry him, but she couldn't not marry him.
Women.
And so she and her stories about the farm, she was always going to be in there. What I wasn't going to do is follow through with her life after John and John's life after Cecily necessarily. It was all about this period. But after, and I won't go into the details, but all sorts of discussion and angst about this, people who read these very dry drafts said, actually, this is a book about relationships, not just your parents, but your parents with each other and with other people. And that's the focus. So yes, Cecily needs to be there. Now, we had Cecily's voice. We didn't have much of John's voice. We had newspapers and things, but we had Cecily's voice because she was... She internally articulated to herself, and she wrote things, and she had letters, and she had journals, and so on. So I said to Meredith, if we're going to do this, you're going to have to help me with all that. But Meredith, it's very important that well before I thought of this book, Meredith was the NLA's official interviewer for Cecily's oral history. It's here, lodged in the library. So there was Cecily having this intimate discussion and oral history with Meredith. And then so Meredith got together a lot of material and helped me with the Jung thing, interviewed her clients and so on. So we had these two stories, completely different stories. One, a very introverted woman with a private life and feeling all the time unfulfilled, and one with a public, controversial man. Very different. How on earth do you do this? I don't know. So it was agony. But Meredith was right, because the more we researched and the more things we found, and we changed it from the boring, dry narrative of third person to memoir, so that we could say, what did you think of that? And my diaries and so on, and it came to life a bit then, and then we got really interested in what we found. So there you go.
Wow. It is interesting, though, from my point of view. My first reaction was, I knew about John Burton, right? He was preached to me as a public servant when I came here in 1966 as an example not to follow.
Bit harsh.
Politically compromised. That was the phrase that was used. But your account of him is, you're right, he's much more multifaceted than that. But the thing that struck me most about him is, as a public servant, you describe in the book a trip to Goulburn with Everett in the car,
Yes.
right? He goes with, he's working for Everett, he's going to Goulburn in the car because that's the only hour he can get of Everett's time, right? And there's another car trailing them that's going to bring John back from Goulburn. He gets to Goulburn and he finds that he's had a wonderful philosophical discussion with Herbert Vere Everett about almost everything, and none of the issues were resolved. But the lesson he drew from that was, wait a minute, we were having a philosophical conversation, but what he was doing was giving me the framework in which decisions are made. And if you take on the framework and you've got it, I don't need to be involved in the decisions. You take them for me. And in fact, they did. He did. And Everett always seemed to accept it, which is extraordinary, because Everett accepted very little from anyone. Meredith, you were a senior public servant.
Not with the name Burton, Nate.
Yeah, no. We'll get on to that. But you ran into those sorts of things all the time. Like, you're confronted, you're working for a senior minister, a very activist minister, and people want you to read his mind, and you're representing him. How much confidence did you have that you were able to do that, given what you knew about how John Burton's experience of doing that was?
Well, I learnt one thing from my father, is that you had to read them. You wouldn't get the words necessarily. You had to find the intent. So when I remember, often there were parallels when I was working for Brian Howe in that way, that he didn't necessarily articulate exactly what he wanted, but I knew the broad framework. So there was a parallel in that. But the other aspect is I was very conscious, because he had the political side, because he had stood for Labor while he was a public servant. I learnt very early on, when I was a public servant, that I had to be absolutely impartial, because people might judge me because of my father.
And they did.
In the end, they did. In the end, I was told I wouldn't become a secretary because of my genes. And so
Not these genes.
So I asked the question of Max Moore-Wilton, well, what would you do with me, Max? He was giving me, I think it was 4 out of 5 for my performance, so he wasn't putting me down, but he was probably anticipating what Howard. And so I said, what would you do with him, Max? He said, well, how about, I was a deputy in Prime Minister and Cabinet, then he said, how about being a deputy in Veterans Affairs? So that's when I knew that I needed to look around for something else.
Mind you, you could have ended up Secretary of Defence, which is what Allen Mawer did.
If I was very ambitious, I would have tried, wouldn't I? Yes. I think our father might have wanted to go into politics, probably not to sit on the backbench for any length of time, but to be Foreign Minister. It's possible. He never did articulate that to us.
Well, let's explore that a bit, because it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, he originally wanted to stand for Canberra in the first election where this electorate voted, 1949. Didn't get pre-selection, but stood for Lowe against Billy McMahon in 51. Lost, of course. But by then, of course, his colours had been nailed to the mast. He had already compromised himself as a public servant by merely taking a political stance. But my question about him is, that only cost him his career. How would engagement, his desire to be an agent of change, have held up had he been elected and had to endure 2 decades of opposition? Isn't academe, which is where he ended up, a safer and more satisfying place for a person of principle?
Just before Meredith answers that question...
I'm sorry, you can answer it if you like.
No, I'm not going to answer it. Just want to make it clear that having stood for the seat of Lowe and losing it, whatever happened then, or was it early that, Menzies came in to power, so Labor lost. Menzies took him back on. He was head of department and with Foreign Minister Spender. They wanted him. Spender did. Menzies said, I'm never going to, but he did. And John represented Australia. He actually had in the conference at Bagua in the Philippines. And I'm sure he wouldn't have survived. You're probably quite right. Everything else you say is probably quite right. But it was over Korea. He just could not. He was very, very tired and he was sick of all this, but it was over the Australia's policy in the Korean War why he resigned or took leave. So, but still, he wasn't going to survive in the public service. So your question's valid, but got to get the facts right. He actually was taken back by Menzies. Meredith.
Well, I think it was a lucky escape that he didn't go into politics, because I think he had very poor judgment sometimes. He knew what he wanted, but he didn't know how to get there. So he thought he could do it through the political route. But he's not a team player. He was never a team player. He's an individual on his own with ideas, looking for disciples for his ideas. He wasn't someone who was going to get in there and find out other people's ideas and help promote them. So he had plenty of strengths, but that's who he was. So it was a lucky escape, and he was much better suited, in my view, to academia, where he could have his views out there, he could write them and gain, as he did, disciples to his approach to conflict resolution and globally.
Was it a bit of a messianic mission?
Very similar. There's a sort of Methodist background in all of this, remember. He was the son of a Methodist minister.
Yes.
So the Protestant ethic is very strong.
Yes.
Would you agree, Pam?
Very definitely that. In fact, we talk about Cecily fighting and struggling to come out of John's shadow, but while we don't articulate it directly in the book, you can read the book, John has been struggling to come out of his father's shadow, not just childhood, but right through, even as head of foreign affairs, Reverend John Burton Sr. was still this radical, very influential, what do you call it? What's the word for the religion?
President of the Methodist.
Well, he was former president of the Methodist Church, but he had played a substantial role in stopping the in Fiji, New Guinea, and other places the Kanakas in the sugar cane.
Indentured labour.
Yeah, the indentured labour. And my father, it's a hard act to follow. And even while my father at age 31 or something is doing these things on the international stage, his father is still there doing all these things. So I think he was struggling to come out of the shadows too, and not succeeding anywhere. I mean, even initially in academia, at the ANU he didn't succeed. He's tried still to have influence in foreign policy by taking a stand, his own stand and writing books and things on that then. But yeah, so but ultimately I absolutely agree. He was better. Well, he was better as an academic. He wasn't a brilliant writer though, Meredith.
No, he wasn't.
His wives had to edit everything.
And that's another thing. I mean, basically, among other things, Cecily was his amanuensis, wasn't he? She did. She corrected his grammar.
Yes. And his expression, and went further and asked for sources.
What struck me was, here are two gorgeous people. I mean, look at them. Terribly handsome couple. Both incredibly intelligent, both of them. Equally matched in almost every respect, including in terms of background. They embark on a marriage. They both accept that the roles assigned to them are the roles of the 1930s, homemaker on one side, provider on the other. But even accepting it, there were strains in it, weren't there? Because John wanted to run her side of the partnership as well as his own. Is that unfair?
No.
It's not unfair, and I said to you, a bit harsh, but then again, everything you say is right. But the context, I've been thinking about this since writing the book, you know, the context is leaving aside the fact that the male public servants in Canberra at that time treated their wives pretty badly, and sometimes Dad looked quite angelic by comparison. Leaving that aside doesn't justify him. But Cecily was a very introverted person, and as I said, she had the ability to internally articulate where she's feeling misunderstood or unfulfilled, and wrote about it and so on. Dad, our father, as a young public servant, and he was young, as a young head of foreign affairs, would be coming back from work, and we're on the farm still, coming back from work, having tried to solve, because he would solve rather than advise, every difficult post-war political problem you could have. He would come home from work, and instead of saying, "Hi darling, I'm home," his head would be full of ideas, and he would go out and round up the sheep and shovel shit, as he would say it. He does his best thinking, come in. And so he wasn't very communicative, but how much of the angst and the trouble, you know, what the problems he had at work every day, and it really was quite a hostile, competitive environment, how much did Cecily understand? Had she been a much more outgoing, extroverted person, and I'm not saying she should have, she might have been able to say, "What's on your mind, John? What are you thinking?" I'm sure my father couldn't internally articulate anything about that. But she didn't. So he wasn't communicative, and he thought he was always doing the right thing, you know, buying things and doing things, and never consulting her. So there was tensions from day one, I'd think, wouldn't you, Meredith?
Well, they were opposites.
Yeah.
So, you know, they were absolute opposites in many, many ways. And the thing that I find so fascinating is that they have the same shared values, but
Absolutely.
they interpreted them differently. So you think about conflict resolution, and Dad's thinking globally, and Mum's thinking about individuals. Or think about the sense of identity. Dad was very strong on making sure emerging countries had a sense of identity and could see why some wars might occur because of a lack of a sense of identity for a country. And she would talk all the time about the importance of a sense of identity for for an individual. So they shared a lot, but their approach was so different, and they were like this. And my father used to even say, "Your mum's talking mumbo jumbo," like no respect really for where she was coming from.
And that's what in the end undid the marriage, wasn't it? She felt she wasn't respected.
Yeah.
That's basically it. Yeah.
But
that was not uncommon in those days, as Pam said. That we can remember many fathers of that time that were worse as fathers, as husbands and fathers. And as a father, when I was reflecting on that, I always thought, even though our parents didn't get on, they were good parents. Now, in brackets, I had to do what Dad wanted me to do, and I'd follow him everywhere, and that's how I communicated with him. But at the time, I thought, yes, they're good parents. There are some exceptions, and one of the daughters of one of the exceptions is in the room tonight. But there were fathers that I really looked up to, but they were more the exception than the rule around us. So that was just that time was different. Well, maybe it's not so different, but anyway, it was a time when the father did rule. And that was accepted.
If the relationship was projected forward to today, and they're still the same two people that they are now, but the times they have changed, would there be any different outcome?
Who knows the counterfactual there? What do you think?
Yeah, starting afresh. What we do know is that Cecily, having found herself and worked through all this and leaving him, and they both went their separate ways, but actually never let go. I think they always loved each other, couldn't live with each other. But the end result, and coming full circle as the last chapter, is John is in awe of Cecily. She is the matriarch. In the end, she's quiet, she's gentle, but he looked up to her. And that was a big change.
So the times had changed to suit them.
Well,
And they
they
mellowed.
both worked through. Huh?
They mellowed.
They mellowed. Yeah, so, and it's interesting because they stayed in touch, so as did, Cecily married John's best friend and probably the only person in the world he ever confided in and talked about anything to and wrote letters to, Robert Parker. So here we are in our senior years, and you've got Cecily and Robert and John and his third wife, and there we all are having a look at the Heritage Melrose Valley Tuggeranong on open day. It's unique, isn't it, that really, that's Cecily's doing. Cecily, we all ended up, 3 children, and we all somehow mislaid or lost our partners. Cecily kept in touch with every single one of them. And all the Christmases was us and them and the parents' partners and our partners, our former partners, and it went on. And these huge Christmases that were happening, everybody turned up. So we became, from this, I would say, totally dysfunctional family in our upbringing, although I enjoy my childhood enormously, we became a family that everybody would come to in these later years.
Well, let's do another counterfactual then. Cecily always wanted a man.
Yeah,
It was
that's
first
funny.
your father, okay, and then it was Robert, and both of them failed her. Now, my question is, would she have been happier had she acknowledged that men will just be men? You either accept them or forego them, but they're almost impossible to change, and if you're really serious about your own integrity, the celibate life is for you.
Well, remember in those days the financial dependence of wives on husbands.
But she overcame that.
She did eventually, but
Yes.
most people around her didn't.
No.
And you remember that there's a book, wonderful book called Our Mothers that Robbie Henderson
Yes, it
put
is.
together. And that tells many stories of many mothers in that era and what their role was like. And the question asked is, were they happy?
Yeah.
Now, most of those did not escape their marriages, but Cecily was in the vanguard of escaping. So that made, that was unusual for the time. Sorry, I didn't get to your question, which was?
Well, would she have been happier
Oh.
just solo?
No. There was a dependence, wasn't there? But she's seeking to be understood, as if the two people are part of a whole in a marriage. She was idealising a relationship.
Right.
And she didn't feel she was totally understood.
I don't get it, actually, because she used to say to us, she gave us this book, Why Am I Nothing Without a Man? She used to say to us, you've got to...
There was such a book, was there?
Something like that, yeah. In other words, you shouldn't feel like you're nothing without a man.
Right.
So she was telling us something completely different, that basically, basically you have to find yourself before you can relate to somebody else anyway. But she didn't do that. She wasn't... She would have in her 80s or 90s, if she'd found that quote right man, probably left Robert. But she wasn't going to leave him. Men do that. They never leave their wives until they've got somebody else in place. I've noticed that, yeah. But women, I didn't know they did that. True.
Well, unfortunately, it is. There is one episode which in my interpretation of the reading of the book, was in fact what precipitated the breakdown of the marriage. It took a long time to happen, and that was when he was posted to High Commissioner in Ceylon, and an election was called, and he just abandoned the entire family there and went back to fight the 1951 election. Cecily clearly regarded that as beyond the pale, and she took a lover.
Yeah, she struggled on for 10 or 15 years, but that was the beginning of the end, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, listen, why do all the men that read this book fall in love with Cecily as we portrayed her? Because she was naughty, wasn't she?
Look at this. This is one of the most gorgeous women you'll ever see.
So she took a love. Okay, yes. We are sympathetic to Cecily because we're sure Dad had many before that. But yes, there she was, alone and miserable in a culture that she was finding that was in Ceylon, a culture that she really quite actually loved, but it was very, very different. Lone and miserable, and Dad put his friend Raju, yes, so he's Sri Lankan, he was Ceylonese, in charge of her. So he wanders in and sees that she's bloody miserable and really looks after her, as one might do. And she was really taken with the care and the gentleness and all the things she wanted to import into John, which she couldn't do. So yes, her mistake was ultimately owning up to that. Because you don't do that, he should have let it go, because he wasn't ever going to own up to his affairs.
But how did you feel about it at the time? I mean, you were probably too young. You were only 6 years old at that time. But
5,
Meredith,
yeah.
you were older.
No, I was about 10,
Yes.
and it didn't affect me at all.
Okay.
And my mother would often say that she wasn't a good mother because she was always distracted with, appealing to John or whatever it was, and or her own psychological needs. But I never felt that with Mum. I always felt she mightn't have listened to everything I had to say. That didn't worry me. It didn't worry Pam either. It did worry our sister Claire because she felt that Mum wasn't giving her enough attention. But it didn't worry me, and I just felt my mother was like a rock. It didn't matter what I did,
Yep.
she would always be there. She was not judgmental the way our dad was. So that was incredibly important growing up, to have someone like that, as your mother in your life.
Well, given the internal turmoil she was going
Exactly.
through, I mean, it's an amazing achievement, isn't
Absolutely.
it? That your children were oblivious to it.
And
more or
practically
less.
to the day she died, she was counselling one of us or one of our children who might be having marital difficulties. But she was always giving out and loved helping other people in relationships, in dealing with relationships.
Now, we're running out of time, so I want to give you two an option just to say anything you want to say before we go to questions.
I'm looking forward to questions.
Me too. I think so many people to come along. It's because it is a bit of a self-indulgent sort of book to write about your parents, and people
No,
have
it's only
come here.
simple when you write about yourself.
Oh, okay. I'm looking forward to questions. I hope there are some.
Well, the floor is open, ladies and gentlemen. If any of you would like to ask any questions of our two authors, or 1 and 12.5% authors.
I didn't write a word.
But she did heaps and heaps and heaps of work.
Yes.
There should be a microphone.
Here it comes. Please wait, because they'll want to record these immortal words for the video stream.
This is being streamed, so everyone on Zoom needs to see and hear it.
Thanks very much. I warned Meredith that I was going to ask a question today, but unfortunately Alan's already asked it, so I'll ask another one, which is, can you talk about what it's like to take the messiness and uncertainty and ambiguity of a family's sort of life experience and process that and turn it into a book and into a story? Because I think there's things that you gain and lose through that process, and I'm just wondering how you found that.
What did we do? I'm not sure how I did it.
If I think about my family history,
Yeah.
and I were to try and convert it into a book,
Where would you
I think
start?
that would change the story in my head. So
Heisenberger
it's
principle.
a conversion from what's in your own sort of mind and life experience and the sort of the
Yes,
life of the family
okay. Well,
into a written story.
Yeah, well, for me, it's pretty simple. I had this vision, you know, of always about how Cecily met John and how she knew she shouldn't marry him, etc. And I had this, as I explained in the opening, you know, well, all these things he did, this was my life. And we had information, well, as it turned out, lots and lots from Cecily's writing and thinking. But I had been, and my former husband, got 2.
Not at the same time?
No, and all the rest were never husbands.
Oh, right, okay. Just as well.
So, you know, in my younger days and in the 60s, 70s and whatever, I collected stuff on my dad. I wanted to understand. I've got the volumes of transcripts of Petrov. I've collected stuff. I kept all his letters to us and so on. So basically, Meredith will say it was we did a dump. All right. So I had these sort of chapter headings. This is a picture I have of my father and our life. But this Methodist influence was really important, and I knew that our granddad has an incredible story. So I did do a bit of the conventional stuff about, you know, they were born on and their grandparents and their parents were. But basically, Meredith's right. I had just one huge, huge, huge document, and every time I thought I put my story in from diaries, from what we knew, from letters, and where there were gaps, we'd off to the library, we'd go and we'd work out and we'd research newspapers. Everything just went in. Everything went in. And it kept going like you have no idea how big this one manuscript was. But my legal training, I suppose, and having written an unauthorised biography of a live person who said, I don't want this written, and therefore I had no information, I used that Gaudron experience and I did the longest, biggest, best chronology over years and years that you could think of. So not only birth dates and marriage dates, but war and when Nehru died from my diary, Nehru? No, yes, Nehru. I did a chronology, and that's the checker. That's the one that says, my view is this, but that can't have happened, what about that? So I did always add to that chronology for factual and try and keep it objective. So I don't know, it was basically the dump, and then it was basically the information we had, and the story kept coming out, so it kept going. Does that answer it? Not really.
But it was first of all more a description of what had happened.
True.
And it didn't have a liveliness about it. And one of the people who looked at it said it should be more like a memoir.
Yes.
And that gave Pam and me permission to say I and we.
Yeah.
Because she had her diaries, I had my journals, and we were able to bring some of ourselves into it. And that made a big difference to how it was written. So it was the same material, but we were able to craft it better. It's almost like a piece of clay that you're moulding into something, shaping as you go. You're not sure where it's going to end up, but you know when you're getting close, and then you use we used a lot of people who read and reread to give us a good feel for whether we were getting there or not.
Yeah. So if there's no questions, there might be someone that has some memories about this period of time and remembers the bookshop or the
but
please.
Questions first.
If there are any.
Yeah, if there are any. Come on, this must be someone. No? Ah, there's one up there, yes.
Thank you. You mentioned that you observed John mellowing over time, although that he did mellow over time. Were you actually aware of that as it was happening? And if so, was it politically or personally or in some other way?
I think I noticed it when he had a son, and his second wife then, they were in England, was working full-time, and he was starting to phase out his full-time career a little and farm and work from home. So he had to do a lot of the caring and even cooking. So I saw a change then, and I might have been a little envious as well. Even with Pam, I think he spent more time with Pam than he did with me. So over the years, he became more, his rough edges came off in terms of the parenting side. When he came to his third wife, who was never a challenge to him, as the first and second were to some extent, he really loved her. And that's when I think that a lot of mellowing took place, and she was able, into her own way, to make him into a reasonable, relatable human being.
So it's not true. You can change men.
You don't expect to change them.
Cecily's words were always, you can't change other people, but you can change the way you respond to them and then let them take the consequences. So she knew you can't change men, but that was the other contradiction, because she wanted to change them.
Yeah. Another one over here, please.
It's a long way in.
How do you think your parents will feel about having their lives exposed in this way?
It's a very good question. Well, I think we really agonised over that, but Cecily actually really wanted people to know who she was, not the confident not the confident person she projected, but this internal turmoil. And we know that because we wrote this, she gave us a lot of, she wrote letters to me when I asked her about her life, and we did a little book called Cecily, and she said, I hope this continues. However, I'm not so sure about the actual detail we went into with her relationship with Robert or not, but she wrote it all. It was all there, and she gave us. She made sure we had all this material before she died. John would have been, oh gosh, pleased that his other career was sort of, his farming career and things was mentioned. He would have hated it because he wasn't ever very honest about his bad behaviour. But I'll tell you what is the most interesting thing. I was desperately worried about his third wife, Betty, who lives in USA now. And we're, we're in touch with her a lot, and she's 93 now. Desperately worried. I know she didn't know about this background and this past. And so we talked to her daughter and said, what are we going to do, And, well, the biggest fans we have for that book is not only her daughter, Andy, but Betty herself. And I said, Betty, we were so worried about, because he's never owned up to you about his philandering and all these things he did. And she said, good heavens, Pam, look at the man. Of course he's going to have all these. What would you expect? He was a beautiful, handsome, intelligent man. She loved the book.
Any others? Yes? Another one here, please. Oh.
Oh, so we've got Di there too.
Hello, Meredith. Hello, Pam. My name's Margaret Beerlin, who some of you might know of. I couldn't stop reading it, no matter what time of night it was or morning, because so much of it overlapped with this family life, at least the life of my oldest brother, who was a member of the Communist Party, and all of the ramifications of that with ASIO and all this sort of stuff. And so it made the whole thing alive. But much more than that, I knew Meredith when she was quite young, and she might remember, but when you were a student, first of all. And so it's been absolutely fascinating to me to read the detail of your lives. And I suppose I'm not asking a question, but I'd love to talk to you more privately. I just am such admiration of you for your courage in writing with such candour about your family's lives, because I wouldn't dare to do that about my family's lives. And it was a dysfunctional family too. But it's so important, and it's so helpful to those of us suppose most people here have had dysfunctional families, but we're brought up to think they weren't all like that.
Yeah.
And so I want to say thank you.
Well,
Very
Margaret.
many different ways. And thank you for your inspiration as women and what you have done with your lives, given the turmoil that you grew up amongst. And I absolutely love that you had the time on the farms, because I had that experience in my life too. But yes, so thank you very much indeed.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank
Now,
you.
I think we are running out of time, but there were two other people who had their hands up, so can we have questions from them, please?
Diane's important.
And then we'll have to
Fine.
call
Thank
it.
you very much for writing the book. It was a wonderful read.
Thank
And
you, Steve.
I got to admire your father's work in foreign policy, even though he was actually in the role as head of foreign affairs for only a short time. But particularly what I noted was his work with Everett on advocating for Indonesian independence.
Yep.
This is basically an unheralded story of Australia's successful foreign policy move after the war, because the Dutch wanted to come back and resume colonial rule, supported by the English, and Everett and your father really they trumped them, right? And it's paid off in our relations with Indonesia.
Yes, thank you.
Our closest neighbour. But anyway, that's by way of a comment and a thank you. But just one question, and that was, do you think your father was a better farmer and entrepreneur than a diplomat?
Probably absolutely, and it proves that he couldn't have been a communist, because he really was an excellent in private enterprise and an entrepreneur. He was a very different sort of diplomat. Well, I really thank you for raising the Indonesia thing. That was so much he's doing, and that is really a contribution he's left for Australia. I'd love to hear Diane's question, because she's...
I think we had one more question.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the book. It's marvellous. Yes, kept me up all night. And I think actually you've created a new genre in writing. It's not a biography, it's not a memoir. It's incredibly brave, everything that everybody said in praise of it. And it's a book that listening to people talk, they have different responses to it. Different people come into it from different angles. And I'm wanting to ask you as writers, how has the book been reviewed, and how has that set you thinking about other aspects of the book, as the way in which you cast it, where you started, Pam where you started, and Meredith where you started, how you wheeled it into a book that is such a fantastic piece of literature.
Yeah.
How has that been responded to
Well,
by the reading public?
we're gobsmacked, because while we haven't been invited to talk on the radio or do anything really, the reviews on national magazines and over the place have been phenomenal, and strangely, mostly male political scientists and so on. They've been phenomenal, and my daughter said to me that, well, this is an era of truth-telling, and that's what you've done. And so while I am certainly not an academic, not a public servant or any of those things, if through naivety, and that is what it was, because I just got all my material together and did the book, and Meredith was a very good editor. She was a non-critical editor. She let it all go through, more or less. She didn't say, you can't say that. So it was through naivety. But we're finding that academics are saying, oh my gosh, maybe I can do that. I've got this biography I'm writing in the tricky relationships, and I was going to hide it a bit, sort of. But so totally, we're gobsmacked with the way it's been received. I did not know. I didn't follow any conventional rules about. I don't know them. I haven't done any except the Gaudron book, which was unconventional anyway. So by not following any rules, total naivety, that's the way, I suppose, you break through. I did that with my legal firm. I didn't know the rules about that either. I was a girl and I started this legal firm, and it became a very different model. So maybe I did it unknowingly, but Meredith never objected, and she's the public servant and the proper one. You liked it, didn't you, when you started reading that personal stuff? You
Absolutely,
contributed to it.
absolutely.
And she put herself in there.
Yes.
She was so brave. And I said, are you sure? And she said, yes, because it will help other people.
Yes, exactly right.
Yep.
Well, thank you. DG.
Thanks, Alan. So I'm Murray Louises, I'm the Director General of the Library, but I'm also friend of Meredith, and I've been having bits of the book read to me at night, which has been great. It was always lovely knowing when you two were in the library doing your research, checking up on things, you know, up on the first floor or the second floor. So for me, this is very library story too, of course, because it's based on diaries, letters, you know, records, you know, your Petrov affair records. Your dad has got really, for me, a library story. That bus he was taking up to the Snowy Mountains, just think about that is so akin to the kind of the values that drive us here at the library. So it just is a way really of saying that I think the book has got so many things, you know, if you're a public servant, you're interested in foreign affairs, you know, terrific, something for you. If you're really interested in dysfunctional marriages, and yes, I grew up with my parents in one of those as well. But I think also it's such a Canberra story, and for those of us who are really long-term Canberra people, it's really fantastic to see this story, you know, playing out against the background of a city that is changing around them and changing around us. So I just wanted to offer a really special vote of thanks to these marvellous women for writing this fantastic book about absolutely fascinating parents, and Alan, to you for steering a conversation between these two really strong women. So they could have taken over completely, couldn't they? So thank you very much, and thanks for coming along.
The book is available online from ANU Press for free
of charge.
And you can speak to you can speak to the girls if you'd like to try and get a hard copy.
And Meredith, Pam and Alan, there's something here for you from the friends. And look, I just want to say what a stimulating evening it's been. And I know I've asked this question. It must have been very difficult for you, writing about your parents. And something I thought of, if my sister and I were writing about my parents, our parents, we would have very different views and different stories to tell.
We didn't have a fight once.
No,
Not even one. That's great.
we didn't have fights.
Are you good sisters?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was unnecessary, but thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ooh, lovely. Oh, very nice. Thank you.
Just peel it off like glasses, but backwards. I'll do it if you like.